Are you related to the
Oh, yes. No, I have a fun story with that. The show. That's it.
We have 14
Sorry to break up the conversation to start a new one, but welcome. I have the privilege of seeing Sarah's work come alive in Venice over the last 1 month, as some of you have as well, and I can give a personal perspective on its coming alive. And my perspective is very unique. I'm a writer and I'm a scientist, and to see work of this complexity come alive has many resonances across the many worlds that I also inhabit. In the middle of all of this, I had the privilege to go to see, whilst I was still in production, to go to see the monastery where Mendel discovers genes, which is in a tiny town in the Czech Republic called Brno. And it was an incredible experience. It's between Vienna and Prague. It's a kind of a way stop between Vienna and Prague. And what's interesting is when you go to Brno, you go to a monastery, and the plot of land where Mendel planted his first peas, which would ultimately reveal the existence of genes, which, by the way, is most likely one of the most important ideas of the 20th century, bar none. It ranks with the idea of the atom, it ranks with the idea of information as one of the central, seminal ideas of the 20th century. And the garden where these peas were planted is no bigger than this space. And he was a monk. He planted peas, he shelled the peas every day himself. He binned them into categories, and he wrinkled peas on one side versus non-wrinkled peas on the other, yellow peas on one side versus green peas on the other. And by this kind of methodical, meditative, monk-like activity, he was able to all of a sudden decipher the idea which had eluded human beings from the beginning of history, which is that, weirdly enough, heredity is transmitted as particles of information. I mean, how weird is that? How bizarre is that? That we should transmit heredity not through continuity, not through any other mechanism, but as atoms almost, as little particles of information. And these particles of information move between parent and child and carry not everything about ourselves, but a vast fraction of our identity, the way our bones are formed, the way our noses are formed, the way our faces are formed, the way our personalities are formed. And when I went in there, I said to myself, I'd come from Cambridge, where I was visiting as well, and Cambridge is a typical massive university. You go to Cambridge and you say, well, knowledge can be produced here. This is where knowledge happens. And then from Cambridge you come to Brno, to this monastery, and you say, how on earth could this man, of all places, discover? Rutherford was in Cambridge discovering the atom. How could Mendel be in Brno discovering the gene? How on earth could be one of the most seminal ideas of the 20th century, perhaps seminal ideas in human history, be produced? And I thought about, this is what I was thinking about when I was in Venice. I was walking around, and my central question was, what gives? That Mendel, of all these people, a plodding monk, could produce this idea? And finally, as I saw Sarah's piece coming into action, I figured out the answer. And I figured out the answer, and I think I was inspired by looking at Sarah's piece, and I realized that the answer was tenderness. Mendel was a gardener before anything, before he was a monk, before he was a scientist, and tenderness, the word comes from tending a garden, tending something, giving it the labor, which ultimately produces wonder, it produces science, it produces art. And so I was moved by this idea that tenderness, the act of something we have to make with our own hands, the act of producing something with your own hands, inhabiting spaces, much like a gardener inhabits spaces, tending plants. And then I was also inspired by the opposite of tender, And it's a word that actually comes from the same derivation, which is tension. In fact, tenderness and tension, it is a peculiarity of English language that both these words actually emerge from the same idea, which is to stretch. And it comes, of course, ultimately from the idea of stretching a plant to make it grow. A plant grows by tenderness, it grows by tending, and grows by tension. And I found every time I would go back, once this revelation had come to me about both Sarah's work and Mendel's piece, I found that actually the whole installation began to make sense to me in this very particular way, through a peculiar crisscrossing of tenderness and tension. So these are abstract ideas. I think every time I go back into the piece, installation, I see them come alive in many ways, and it's been a real privilege to see it come in action. And finally, we wanted to do this so that we can welcome our closest friends to Venice. There are big parties and there are small parties. You're amongst the closest of our supporters, and the closest of Sarah's supporters. So thank you, and thank you, Sarah, for producing something that is simultaneously so tender and so tense.
Well, again, one of the wonderful things about Sarah's work is that it gets you to riff in your own mind.
Yes.
And you were riffing, and then when I walked into Sarah's incredible universe, the thing that I started riffing off was actually my favorite painting in Venice, which you all may have seen, which is in the little Scuola di San Giorgio, which is closed at lunch, so go either before 12 or after 3. And it is a beautiful, beautiful painting of St. Jerome in his study. And there's a little white dog, and there's an open book, and there are all of these little objects that are drawn from everything that are brought together in this library. And St. Jerome has just heard something and is looking up. And on his desk is a seashell, and on his desk is a globe. And I couldn't help but think about this painting, and you reminded me when you were talking about this not so great distance between a place like Cambridge that hatches the most extraordinary intellectual heights of human knowledge, and a place like a garden, which is where that knowledge really begins. And Sarah, your work covers the arc of that production, from labor to the absolute heights of civilized thinking from the very, very, very beginning. And I kept toggling between those two extremes every time I turned left and right to look at your work. There was a particular moment for me when I was standing in the second room and looking through this enfilade that you created to a rectangle of blue, the most beautiful blue. And you don't know until you get there that it's sky. Is it sky? It's a poster of the sky. And it's the most beautiful room. But then you look down and you see that the tape that every artist uses to grid off when they're painting, or that every painter uses to paint a room, it's there again. And I thought, this is Sarah's blue, a blue that is really grounded both in the sky, but also in workman's materials, also in that kind of strip of blue that that every installer puts on the wall. Once you've told them, yes, 2 inches, just so, and to the right there, they put them there, and then they walk away. And this meeting of workmanship, really laborious workmanship, with the absolute heights of what we see in nature and what we see in our own minds, is something that kept happening to me as I was walking through your show. And the armature of those rocks are like the globe, like the universe, like the Vesuvian Man. The way that these things, you kept collapsing them one into the other. But I wanted to ask what you think about that Carpaccio painting.
I was looking over at John, who's telling Rachel to give him some more wine. I was looking at John nodding about the painting, and I have first of all, thank you. That was beautiful about the work. But I was thinking about painting a lot in that last room, and there are many people that I'm very lucky, or many of whom are here out of my studio. But Matt Van Levenstein, Lisa Gavage, John Kern, all, and Rachel, but she's not a painter, so I'm not going to hit it. But the painting in that last room, I think for me, that's a lot of the work is about architecture, because those are the two things I studied were painting and architecture, and I really came to sculpture from those. But the last room for me is very much about painting. You know, that this idea of the window and painting. You know, in architecture, it's also this idea of the, you know, the building disappearing through a window, and that window is so interesting in that building because it exists but is usually covered to reveal that. But the idea of painting, which is so classical and so important to people like Matisse or Vermeer, and I was thinking very much about Vermeer and this idea of the milk bottle to the map to the window and back, and how that can shift so quickly from the scale of the pebble to the boulder.
Yeah. And you had the grid above,
Yeah.
which is a way that Dürer and everybody since,
Yes.
you know, looks
Absolutely.
at the world. And did everybody see that little peephole in the middle room when you looked through it? You saw a grid on nature.
Yes, which is actually, if you go to the Leonardo da Vinci Museum here, which is a museum that a lot of people don't go to, it's sort of slightly off the map, and it's a very funny museum because actually they've rebuilt all of his drawings. Have you been to that museum, Holly? It's incredible. And you can, they're models, which is of course an interesting idea to me. The whole show is about modeling information, but they built the drawings as models, and you can actually use them. So you can actually run them, and there's a whole section on the military objects. There's the first, what they call the first car, but there's an oculus there that you look through, and it has the grid. And of course, this is the classical way, and still, of course, the most obvious way to translate three-dimensional space to two. And so it's really a nod to him, to Dürer. You know, we know that the oculus is a very common usage, and the grid at the end does this too, because you know people talk about that grid. Of course, it was a solution to make your eye move horizontally in that space, but it's actually also evidence of the way the pieces are moved. So that in that room, it really was a studio space, that last room, because the backspace in that pavilion is very, very limited. That closet space is one of 4 closets for the entire space. So to install there, you need to use the rest of the space. So that last room was actually the studio space for the installation, and I realized that it was important that the whole installation unravel there, and that if you spent time in that last room, it was like a forensic site for the actual installation itself. So everything that happened there was just actually a real palette for the piece that was then stopped at a moment in time. And the grid on top is actually how you move the pieces. So if you went to any moment in the grid, you could say, this is F4, and you would look down, and that was actually an incidental moment that was actually framed by what is the most basic way to understand information through the grid.
Well, then you just circled back to Carpaccio because you're really talking about the studiolo.
Right,
This
of course.
a studio
Yes.
that is also
Yes.
a
Yes.
place where
Yes.
the process of
Yes.
thinking
Yes.
is made
Yes.
manifest
Yes.
on your shelves.
Yes. And I was thinking about another very basic painting idea. I was thinking about this idea of plein air, because I wanted, when you came back to that last room, that you were in the interior of a studio that felt very exterior, but that you also had this discovery of a new space that you had actually seen but not understood, which is the interior of the outdoor piece. So when you come in there, you're an interior studio that feels very exterior, but you recognize out the window that there's actually an exterior studio that feels quite interior. And this idea, really, that piece at the end is, the outdoor piece is really only revealed to you in totality till you get to the end. And this was one of, the last few days have been incredible and been an amazing experience throughout, and many of you have supported me in ways that I'm incredibly grateful. But this last few days has been also really interesting because you get to see how people behave in the space. And Rickard and I did a conversation actually for Art Forum that was very much about this, is that this moment where you see how people behave around the work, how they move you know, and even I remember Rick Riggy said to me, you know, laughing when I said there's going to be a circulation, and you were like, you can't get people to circulate in certain ways in Venice. You know, other people said you can't do the exit doors because everyone will try and escape through the front door. You know, because they'll be like, I gotta get to that other pavilion, or they'll open the door and look in and they'll go away. And one something that has been very rewarding is actually the speed at which people look in the space and how they behave in the space. And to see that has been really wonderful. There was the windows of the Italian pavilion are incredible, and the Italian pavilion, as much of it is designed by Scarpa, but they put up drywall in front of much of his work. But it's very common in gallery spaces that you need a white wall, so you create these white walls. So if you go to the back of the Italian pavilion, there are these incredible windows that are classic Scarpa design of these two circles that overlap, and you see them with a plywood board behind them. And I wanted to talk about the fact that there was a window there. So in '99, I looked at the plans of the building and I found that there was a window there. So there was a small window that was cut into that window where you could then see the canal. So you were in the Italian pavilion, you get to that back, and you're completely surrounded by walls, and all of a sudden there's this perspective out to locate yourself in space. And the Oculus piece, which is something that, as Holly knows, a lot of the work, that's a piece that never existed until within the last 3 months. That was a piece where I said, wait, there's a window here, and I want people to know, because the windows are very important in the building. The 4 windows that are in the rotunda are in the closets, which is very funny, right? And then so you have the 4 windows in the closets. Then you have the 70s intervention of the creation of the window, but you do have a window that Bruce Nauman had open, but I didn't see in my research anyone else in recent history did, when you walk in, which is an interesting window because it allows you to know there's a backyard and there's a back space there. So that Oculus was important to me to say, actually, there actually is a window here. Because my experience of the pavilion is that people were very liberal about what you could do there. And Holly and Carrie were incredible that way, in that they gave me complete artistic freedom about what to do there, and that was an amazing gift. But the one thing they say you cannot do is you cannot touch that building. I think there's some people here who have done the pavilion in the past and know that. You cannot drill into the building, you cannot make holes. And for me, it was amazing that there was this, in my mind, I met the widow of Gordon Matta Clark last night, and in my Jane Crawford, and I told her that it was very beautiful to talk to her, because it was really, I feel like I have a conversation with him, and I know I'm making these works through knowing his work, and the window to me was really like a ready-made Gordon Matta Clark. It was because it has this, I think this sort of extreme, it's a very extreme architectural gesture. The 70s horizontality with Frank Lloyd Wright, the influence of him, and this idea of the landscape it was very much of the time and very much against the neoclassical building, but it's such a dramatic gesture in that building that it reminded me of this kind of slash in the building of Gordon Matta Clark. And the other place that Gordon Matta Clark, I'll just say, since I think he is an important influence in thinking about the pavilion, that I really thought about his piece, The Plots, that he did in New York. And this idea of not only peripheral spaces or things that are overlooked and underused, but also the negative space in any space you carve out. Because that rotunda is a square room. It's only created round by closets. So those closets are what makes it round. So when you open it up, you understand the reality of that space.
But for those of us who might not know, I love also how you were very, very conscious about the architecture's origin here, and then it's kind of adaptation, perversion through American culture, and then now back. Can you tell us about that for those of us who aren't familiar with Palladium?
Right. Well, I think, I thought, if that the building is based on a Palladian ideal, right, of going into a central location, literally having a compass rose on the floor. The basilica is Plato was the first person who took the basilica top from a church and said, I'm going to make it, I'm going to use it in a domestic space. And famously, he's from nearby the Villa Rotunda, which is sort of his classic piece, is only 45 minutes away, I think. an hour maybe. And this idea that you enter a space and you're completely oriented north, east, west, and south immediately. And this was borrowed famously by Thomas Jefferson. He loved Palladio. He made Monticello based on Palladio. And the White House is based on this ideal. And it's funny because they took, I think, the idea of symmetry, proportions from Italy, but they made them small. They made them domestic. If you go to the White House, it's actually surprisingly small in terms of space. And this building also has that American interpretation of that space. But it was really about throwing that off in every way. Every piece is about being off-center. Every piece is about a kind of flux, a kind of teetering, and not coming into that hierarchy. But I was going to, one thing that I think is very interesting to me, because there are a lot of things that happened in the last 3 months that I had no idea what happened. Because there were 2 pieces that were really seed pieces. There was the planetarium and the pendulum, and they were borrowed. The only ornature on the inside is this compass rose. And so, but I had that as a template to bring to New York and make those 2 pieces. So I borrowed that scale of the architecture and then planted those 2 back, almost like you have 2 quotes and you build everything around it. But the thing that I figured out, which was really tough, actually, I think, to make that building, to make you move into that building and to have a conversation, because the outdoor language is so strong, was the reality of the garden. And the reality of the garden is that the garden is, if you come here off season, which many of you in this room have, what it is teams of gardeners tearing the garden, taming the garden, tearing it off the walls, cutting down the dead trees. And that building is inherently asymmetrical, 1, because of the 70s interaction, but 2, because there's 1 tree on the side. Of course, when it was planted, there were 2 trees, and the whole building was surrounded by a colonnade and grid of these incredible trees that the Giardini has, these beautiful trees. I mean, very sadly, if you come, those of you know, you come back in 2 years ago, there was an incredible tree in the Scandinavia Pavilion, which has died. It's died, so they had to cut it down. But the American Pavilion was flanked by 2 trees, but because nature is asymmetrical and things die, one of them is dead. And so the existing asymmetry is this 70s intervention and the tree. And if you look at the outside of the building, the only thing that is in that installation that is real or existing is that tree. All of the rest of that nature is pulled and is grown, by hand.
You put that ivy on
Yes.
this? You did?
Yes. Actually, I personally did, because to make it look natural was a very hard thing.
Oh.
And this idea, I mean, John said something to me when I did the show at Tanya Bonasters in like a year ago. He said to me, he said, when there was a comment to my show, he said, no one's doing landscape anymore. I'm so glad you're doing landscape. And I love that comment, though, because, you can look at the whole show also, and it's a very, through landscape. But that idea of bringing the landscape in, to blur it in, was I think, for me, that was the solution to making a piece on the outside work, because it's very hard to do an outdoor piece actually in Venice, but that building calls for it because of that courtyard.
I've never been here off season. The way I learned about everything being overgrown is Steve McQueen's video.
Yes, but that's
how I learned stuff about nature.
No, but that's important. I mean, I like to make a piece. You come here in November, and it's a totally different crowd of people, and I like to make a piece that you can enter not knowing anything about art, but that it is in the memory of the, and Steve McQueen's video is important to your experience of, that's why it was a great piece, because you will always remember that. Your whole experience of the garden will always be that, so the garden off season is really, amazing. But I was going to ask, should I ask you a question? I was going to say, because, I was lucky to have a few visitors during the actual installation. Lisa Yuskavage came and visited me, and she was one of the people who said, I just started doing the garden, and she had said, I think you were the one who said, it was with you, I think you alluded, it may not have been you, but the idea of, if you've seen the film Grey Gardens, this idea of, it's very important to me that when you come to a piece, you have this sense of time, that it's both growing and decaying at the same time, and that image, that's an incredible film.
I thought the whole Giardini reminded me. I was like, it's so trashy. I was here in May. What month is it now? I don't know. We're in April.
April.
April. I'm still dizzy.
Yeah.
So just like, I was here a month or so ago, and I was like, my God, it's so, kind of, I've never seen the pavilions, and I thought it was just so rinky-dink. I was really kind of laughing. I was like, wow, it's so under, like it's like all these little huts, and I was like, what is this, the World's Fair?
Well, but
Yes.
I think one thing that's interesting is the pavilions were built as temporary spaces. They didn't know that they would keep them, so they're all temporary structures. Germany still didn't have air conditioning until Henri Sala told them that from France that if I take France, you need to put an air conditioning. They didn't have air conditioning, and they still don't have a toilet there, because they were built as pavilions. It was a fair, and then it became permanent. So it's an interesting idea, the level of.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of things that, you know, because Matthew and I lived in Rome for a year about 6 years ago, and the thing that always struck me, and you see it in artists like Chirico, is the endless weeds growing up in, you know, it's just this, you know, there's this history that is, you know, it's this one thing is like, you can't believe this place still exists, and it's still here.
And it's also like pyramid.
And then, you know, it's just, and it just also like, you know, in spite of everything, like even if it's ruins, that they're still there.
Yeah.
But just the fact that, you know, like in Rome, it's like you got the cats too, but it's like here, it's like the weeds. It's like a very overwhelming thing. Like the stuff just keeps coming and it keeps coming and it keeps coming. And the way, like just seeing your piece, and it was sort of still a kind of, you know, like you were still working on it, and the plant life, just you had just started adding it, and it just made so much sense, like to kind of go in that direction, kind of like. But now, like, because I saw it just before that, and then when it came back, one of the things that I really liked was, and I like generally what art does, when art does this to me, which it makes me start to question everything around me. I start getting kind of weirded out, like what, you know, is that art? You know, is that part of it? I don't, you know, I get very mixed up. You know, and so like the moths on the trees that were sitting in the cafe, I'm like, did Sarah put this there? I started to question so much. You put those bizarre paper mache rocks. Just the craziness of it. I like to call them paper mache rocks. Paper does cover rock after all. And it's like sitting on top of those buildings all over. And it's like, I didn't just think, you know, it's just a very, and I never knew until I watched the video on New York Times that there are no large rocks anywhere in Venice until I heard you say that. It makes sense. I guess everything's been used and cleared away, so you're bringing that back. But
can I tell? Should I explain to Madeline that? So you know, everyone asks, what can you find? What's local? What's from Venice? But actually, I think the most interesting question is, what can you not get in Venice? And you cannot get large natural boulders in Venice, because as Ruskin taught us, when a boulder was brought here, it was used to build a building, you know, and so because the landscape is completely fabricated, right? So there's no existing bedrock here, so you cannot get a rock here. And you know, it's funny because you say the rocks are bizarre. To me, they make so much sense, because the rocks in of themselves are actually very much about this architectural idea that I'm interested in the building, and that how do you change the surface of an object and change actually how you read it gravitationally. It's a very architectural idea, particularly since the invention of steel, because basically buildings, 90% of buildings are not built as bearing wall structures anymore. You don't build if you want to build a brick house, now what you do is you build a steel structure, and there's a huge manufacturing of brick face, because you create this sense of gravitas. And that building is all about creating gravitas. The front of it, you take the columns off, the building does not fall down. The columns are ornature on the building. So to me, to create this object that when you look at it, you know, if you spend time with it, you can tell that it's not real. But you cannot help but ascribe weight to it. When we were moving around, you could not constantly see the comedy of carrying around, because you could not read it as weight. And the second thing that I think is interesting about the rocks is they're extremely hard to make well. And it's not the covering, but it's the shape. Because as the comment about landscape is, it's very hard to imitate nature, to create idiosyncratic behavior to imitate erosion or entropy. So the shape is actually, they're hard to get to look
No,
right.
I saw them in your studio and
Right,
before
you know,
we left,
yes.
and I thought, my God, they look. Should I tell her they don't look so good?
I know you had it now. I know they look now.
They look great. It's like amazing. It's amazing. When people were sitting on the real rocks, I was like, is that the paper mache? I couldn't figure out what was what. No, I mean they completely,
But
and I knew
it's
you would
that
figure it
moment,
out,
it's
but
that
it was
moment.
really trying
Right.
to get that.
Right.
Seemed like it was also
Right.
there was so much being
Right.
accomplished.
Right, but the absurdity of it, because if you classical sculpture, you take a rock, right, and you make something out of it. But this is going, this is going backwards in some way, and and it's, there's a relationship of taking the garden and changing it to something like Roangi, where you see this like, these are structures where or a scholar's rock, where you're trying to find something that is inherently only can be created by nature, right? And the beauty of that moment where you could not create it yourself. The scholar rock, it's all about we couldn't create this ourselves, but we found it. It's an important idea. But so I teach at Columbia. These are my fellow professors who are also tonight acting as feeding us generously. But so I'm going to be very professorial and I'm going to ask them questions. So Tomas, who is a professor at Columbia and actually helped a lot, he helped me actually create the surface. He prints, the surface is all photographs of rocks that the photographs are collected, and then I printed them on Tyvek. So Tyvek, we all know the feeling of Tyvek, we've all gotten a FedEx, is an incredible material that is completely waterproof, right? And so that's, it has, you think it's fragile, and then everyone says...
What is Tyvek made of? Is it fibers?
Yes, and it's
What
very
kind of
hard,
fibers?
it's very
It's
hard to
actually
strip it.
What is it made of?
It's essentially plastic.
Plastic, little feathered.
Like
Yeah. So anyways, the point is that we've been here for 2.5 months, and it
Don't you
rained.
it rains in Venice?
Yeah.
Somebody thought she was just putting paper out there.
Yeah, everyone
What a
thinks
dum-dum.
But so Tomas, having done the prints for the cover of the rock, and then seeing them translated into the rock.
I didn't think it was going to be possible. I said, no, it still looks too much like a photo of something.
Yeah.
But what surprised me is that the weather, the condition, the light, whatever that sort of make it into a real...
So you doubted me? Is that what
I
you're
questioned. I was like, okay,
We're
well,
all
okay.
like, this is not.
But then, I'm walking around, I see your rock sitting on top of that
It's a tough
newsstand thing.
audience.
And it's so believable because the condition of the sun and the weather has shaped it and made it into...
And you see the tree, so eye does this. It's
Exactly,
about the
it's-
context, right?
yeah.
So
Okay.
Rick, after having talked, this is my other fellow, Professor Tiruniha. So after seeing it, because I talked to Rick about how he was in Tel Aviv, we had like a broken...
And MasterChef.
And MasterChef. We haven't decided who the MasterChef is yet.
This time is a collaboration.
This is a collaboration. It was an incredible collaboration. But so we talked by a very shaky Skype interview, which is common with interviews. This will be the last one. No one dessert. But
And dessert is amazing.
and dessert is incredible.
Did you make it?
Everyone made it.
No, this one's Sid.
So after having talked about it, because he kept saying like, well, I was trying to describe to him. He's like, I'm trying to imagine that, and there'd be a pause.
Well, I haven't seen it.
You failed the class. You're gone.
No, I've
They would-
arrived and I've been
Cooking.
busy cooking every day from 9 till midnight, whatever. So I haven't gone
This is
to. This is the first time I've come south of San Marco. So seriously, this is the first art event I've been to in like 6 days.
And you're cooking again.
So yes, and I'm
So-
cooking until Saturday, and Sunday will be my day off. So I will
Sunday's
tell
a
you
good day to
after
stay.
Sunday.
Why is the
No,
rock blue?
Which one are you talking about?
The big rock in the rotunda.
Inside
On
the
the
building.
top.
The big.
No,
No,
the
no,
one
no,
on
no,
the
no,
right.
no, no,
Oh,
no,
in the center.
In the
Yes,
center.
in the center. Well, this is what Tomas has to do with light. So it's a print. If you go to the last room, there's actually color separations of the prints too. There's a blue. There's a cyan. Yes. So you can see the breakdown of it as a photograph. So to me, it's when you deal with photography, now it's like inevitably you have to color correct, and anyways, right? So photography has this quality, this quality. The lighting in that room is a combination of the lighting is very specific. Each room is entirely differently lit in the pavilion. The temperature on each room is very, very specific. And the lighting in that room is from an oculus from the roof, and it's natural light, which is this very strange thing, and it hits the rock. And it has this kind of, it brings up the volume on the blue. It's a print, right? So it appears blue in that light. If you take that rock and you put it outside, it will look potentially gray. But I like the kind of surreal quality of it almost looking like a photograph in the space rather than the thing itself. Actually when I did the Public Art Fund piece, we did a Photoshop of the building going into Doris Friedman Plaza, and it actually looks very much like the piece itself. And you find you find it very much in architecture, where the tools tools for making, whether it's Photoshop or AutoCAD, actually are creating an aesthetic that creates the way we see. So I recognized that piece was quite blue, and I thought, but for me, I thought that was interesting. But it's a very basic painting idea, and it's something that why I was very in love with painting, and I think I tried to recreate for myself in sculpture, which was in painting. There's this thing when you paint. There's this incredible. Those of you who have painted know this. There's the incredible thing of making in the moment, because when you put on a painting a color, it literally changes what every other color in the painting is. Because color is only relation to it. The color of my hand against this black jacket is different than the color on this wall when I put it here, right? So when you're painting, there's this incredible mesmeric quality of. I mean, this is a very traditional way to talk about painting, obviously. But if you're using a brush, and you're using a palette, and you're using tubes of paint, that every time you touch the painting, everything changes in time. And so for me, there was always this incredible experience of painting, in that you lose a sense of time, I think, making it in a way that it's very hard to do in other mediums. So this idea of how color is created only in context is actually, I think, a very complex idea in the work. So it's an interesting question. And you saying, why is the rock is blue? And everyone in this room thinks you're talking about a different rock. Is interesting.
But that also brings up that your entire, it's like an exercise in seeing, and in different ways of seeing. And it reminds me of the first room, which is like a gigantic eyeball, with a kind of green center with neurons coming out of it, as well as a kind of representation of perspective that references the shapes of the high line that you did.
Yes.
And it's as if, and you just mentioned the difference that computers make today. And what I love so much about your work is that I think it could only have happened now. And it could only have happened with the tools that we have at hand now, for how we see differently. And the hand, but also the computer. Perspective, but also the end of perspective. I mean, in a way, your work, which is created in one of the country that created perspective, is a kind of ending of perspective for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe that's a great ending to our talk.